I just realized that I've been coding for 35 years. Where did all that time go? Today I would like to share the most important learnings from that 35 years. So let's start at the beginning, because a lot of you might be wondering how come I learned programming 35 years ago. I don't look that old. And indeed, I was only 8 years old when I learned programming, and about 16 when I actually started earning money from programming. I learned programming because my father was a programmer and I used to play a lot on his computer, and he kind of got annoyed with it. And basically he convinced me that when I play with a video game, the machine is controlling me and I'm not the one controlling the machine. And that programming was all about controlling the machine. And I got really interested in that. So we started by him teaching me QBasic, and I really enjoyed that. I was completely bought in from the first minute, especially when I realized that I could modify existing games, like the Snake game that was coming as an example with the QBasic suite. So I sometimes joke that I immediately started working with legacy code, but it's kind of true. Like, my first exposure to programming was, let's make a small change to this code base, let's figure out what effect it has, and then make another change, and so on and so on. So fairly early on, I was basically doing iterative development in a code base that I didn't really know. And of course, for years to come, this would remain a hobby. But I kept on coding and learning different languages. I started with QBasic, as I mentioned, and then I moved on to Delphi, and then Visual Basic. And when I was in high school, I was learning to drive. And the driving school had a problem. They didn't have a website. This is the mid-90s, right? And at that time, having a website was something new. Most companies didn't have one. And then suddenly a lot of people needed websites. So this person found out that I was coding as a hobby, and then she told me, like, I would pay you if you make me a website. I was like, okay, I can try that. And she wanted to update some of the data fields on the website easily. And since she didn't have any knowledge of HTML or anything like that, I wanted to make sure that it's easy for her. So what I did was to create a Visual Basic application where she could modify the data points. It would be stored in a text file, and then when she pressed another button, that would generate the HTML with the new data and upload it via FTP. And I came up with this solution because I had no idea at the time about server-side scripting, so that was my way of solving that. But then someone told me about PHP, and that's when I started having one gig after the other. At the time, a lot of people were already making simple websites, right? But websites where you could modify data without knowing anything about HTML and even let your users modify data, that was fairly new at the time, and not that many people could do that yet. Basically, 70-year-old me just decided to make some easy money on that. And one funny side story from that era, first I was modifying PHP code and then uploading it to a server. But at some point, for some reason, my local PHP environment broke and I couldn't really figure out why and how to fix it. But I also noticed that I had access to the SSH on that server. So I was like, okay, so I don't have a local environment, but I do have production, and I can SSH into the server. I can use Vim to edit the code, and that's what I did. One of the things that I would do is just go there, create an if statement with my username in it, and then everyone else would be getting the old code but me, the code that I was editing. And of course, sometimes I would make a mistake and then upload a syntax error, and then it would break for everyone. But at the time, I was working on this social network kind of thing, and a lot of the users were on my ICQ. So yes, ICQ. It's been that long time ago. Basically, people would let me know on ICQ if I broke something, so that was kind of my monitoring. In retrospect, of course, you shouldn't do this, but here's the thing. That early experience taught me a very important lesson about iterative development and incremental development. Because I got used to having that really quick feedback loop from production, I never really wanted to settle for less. So when I joined bigger companies where I would have rules and I would have to use Git branches, having to wait several months before my changes would go online, that was always a pain for me. I really enjoy having that immediate feedback. And not just like from tests, that's very valuable, but having that immediate feedback from production, that is the holy grail for me. So basically with every team I work on, I'm trying to push the team towards that early feedback, like make sure that we get feedback as soon as possible and use my level of autonomy and use whatever tools I can to get that early feedback. So I've been freelancing throughout high school and later during university, and of course I learned a lot of things while I was doing that. But when I finished the university, I had the opportunity to take part in a PhD program, and that was my first experience to working with clusters. So the research group that I was working in was doing a drug research. We basically were trying to find small molecules like drug candidates against specific bacterial protein. The first time when I finished a piece of code that was going to run on the cluster, and I remember that moment when I was SSH'd into one of the machines in the cluster that was kind of controlling the others, and I started my script and I heard all those fans spin up, and that was such a powerful feeling. And that feeling also kind of stuck with me, and I got really excited about scaling things, like making sure that we can take advantage of this huge computational capacity that we kind of are building up over the years. After PhD, I decided not to stay in academia, and I first joined a consulting company that I'm not going to name. But the point is that I spent 7 months there, and it was a real culture shock for me. So there, they have not been releasing software for 6 months at a time. And that was the first time when I actually faced that. Like before that, even during my PhD, like whenever I modified code, I could check it in production and running in production the same day. And this was just polar opposite of that. And for me, the whole process was so hard to work with. And what was interesting is that before that experience, I was always kind of ashamed that I had these rogue ways of just modifying things on the server, especially after I learned about Git and I realized how dumb it was to modify code on the server. I kind of felt ashamed. But then once I had this experience of working at this huge company and not being able to see any results for 6 months, I realized that there is something wrong with that. Like, people may claim that waterfall is the right way to do things, but that's wrong. And I'm really glad that I was lucky enough to come across a post from a friend of mine who was organizing a code retreat. And I went to that code retreat, and that was my first exposure to test-driven development and agile in general. And then I started reading up on it, and I realized that, oh, there is this whole other world of how people do software development, and it's so much closer to what I like to do. And that wasn't even talking about continuous delivery at the time. It was just like, hey, you can write tests and you can see the impact of your things immediately. And I was like, oh, okay. And also at this event, I would meet my next boss. He was called Laszlo, and when we were talking, I realized that I want to work for this guy. And this was the one time when I didn't choose the company or the project, I chose my manager. If you have a chance to actually get to know someone who is hiring and you like that person and you want to work with that person, you have a much better chance of having a good professional relationship going forward. And actually, I ended up working 17 years for that company, and a large part of that was this person. So I left my previous job and joined Immersis, and I learned a lot there. And especially from Laszlo. He had a very good eye for good software engineering. That's where I learned to do TDD properly. That's where I learned a lot about extreme programming. They had their own flavor of extreme programming. And to be quite honest, I have not seen a single company yet that had the same amazing culture or even a culture that comes close to what was there at the time. Later on, that kind of changed, but when I joined, that was a really nice place to work. And just a couple of things that I learned during this time. So one of the things that Laszlo used to say is there are no problems, only challenges to be solved. I kind of had the attitude of if I proved that something was theoretically impossible, then it's not possible. And one thing that I realized when I was working with Lasse is that he had this attitude of immediately asking, okay, what is possible? Like, it's not the end of the story to know that some specific solution is not possible. It's only the beginning, because then you can start asking questions about, okay, what is it that we really want to achieve? And is there a way that we can achieve the end goal without trying to bend reality? And the other thing that was really important is that I learned to respect legacy code. So this company had a giant legacy code base, the worst kind of PHP code you can imagine, like rendering code mixed in with business logic all over the place and with lots of duplication. It was very, very hard to make progress in it, and we gradually had to extract things into classes and start build up some kind of a manageable code base. But one thing really stuck with me that Laszlo said was that it's still better to have this naive jumble than to have object-oriented code base where object orientation is really misunderstood, because that would be much harder to fix than having this very naive code base where basically everything is just where it happened to land. But that also gives you a lot of context about when and how and why certain things were added to the code base. But even at this company, when I joined, they were releasing every 3 months. There were multiple things kind of happening at the same time. So one of the things that was happening is that I took over running the code retreats from this friend of mine because he moved to London, and then there was no one running these events in Budapest, and I was the one taking it over. And as I was running these events, I saw a pattern emerge, and that was kind of people saying that it's really nice what we do here with this whole code retreat thing, but all of these good practices that we do here, we wouldn't be allowed to do that in a real job, because at code retreats, the point is that we don't finish the job, and that would be never accepted in a real environment. Which is kind of true, but also I believe that good practices are there so that we can be more effective. If we feel like those practices wouldn't be tolerated in a real production environment, then the question becomes, are those actually good practices? So at this point, I really wanted to create kind of a companion event to Code Retreat that would show people the value of these practices in a more realistic environment, while still providing an environment where people feel confident exploring. The other thing that was happening is that I was still a bit frustrated with only releasing every 3 months. And I was talking about that a lot with my peers and with my boss. There was, of course, a lot of pushback because people couldn't imagine at the time that you could basically release code on the same day. There was this experience of releasing every 3 months, and it was chaotic every time. And no one wanted to have that chaos every day, right? And then at that time, I went to a conference to NDC in Oslo. And there I first heard about continuous delivery. And I was like, okay, so there is a name for this, and I'm not crazy. There is a professional way of actually releasing every day. And at that point, there was a very interesting problem. There was an import process, and this import process was meant to run daily. The problem was that it started to run for more than 25 hours. For most days, that's of course not a daily import. So we needed to fix this ASAP, and we couldn't wait 3 months with the fix. Laszlo came to me and he said, okay, you are passionate about doing this daily releasing. How about you try it with your team? You get to do this specific project. You have to speed up the import, and you need to try and release daily. And that project was really interesting for 2 reasons. One is because we ended up rewriting the whole import process, but incrementally. Like, we took one specific customer, solved the problem for them, and then we already released that after a few days. And that, of course, immediately solved the burning issue. But at the same time, we did this by just simply creating a new piece of code and then adding a router that would decide which code should be running. And that was a really interesting solution that still sticks with me today. So I even had to talk about how to rewrite software successfully, which is going to be linked down in the description, and that goes into a lot more detail about how to do this. But the bottom line is that to have a successful rewrite project, you actually need to do it incrementally and release the increments. And then there are a couple of strategies to do that, which is not obvious. So that was one project that was interesting, and it actually led to the company eventually rolling out continuous deployment to every team, which is something that I'm really proud of. But when we were rolling that out, people were kind of worried about this whole thing. And then this problem that I was talking about earlier with code retreats kind of came together with this other problem of people fearing continuous deployment. And basically that was the point where I came up with a workshop called Lean Poker. I've been talking about that multiple times on this channel. But the nice thing about that was that it provided people an environment where they could try continuous delivery and continuous deployment without risk and basically experience that immediate feedback from production, which is, I think, the main message of that event. And of course, since then, I've been running this with lots of different teams, and it turns out that you can learn a lot of other things as well from a Lean Poker. But this was the reason I created it. I wanted to make sure that people can appreciate that immediate feedback from production, and that people can have a first experience that this is possible and it can be done and it is valuable to do. Another interesting shift in that company was when we started to create microservices. For a long time, we were basically just adding to our legacy code base. We were cleaning it up, we were refactoring it, we were moving pieces out here and there, but it remained a monolith. And then at some point we decided it would actually make sense to break things out. And the product that my team was working on was kind of the central control, and you could create these workflows of actions. And while those actions lived inside the same code base, if something failed, everything failed. And that wasn't a real problem. The problem began when at some point we had microservices that was running independently, and if one of those microservices failed, then our workflow engine didn't fail. And it kept on going even though there was a step skipped. And that created some really expensive mistakes. At that point, my team and me got the job of fixing this, trying to find a way to make sure that everything happened. And for a while, we were hell-bent on making sure that everything happens. And we were trying to immediately retry until something good happens. This was the first time when I was on call. That was not pleasant with a system that was failing almost every night. So basically, it took some time for us to figure out how to do this well. And this was a very important learning. Turns out the trick is that you need to use Zagas and idempotency. So if you don't know, idempotency is the concept of triggering the same endpoint twice and only having that action performed once. So basically the first call is going to do what you want, and the second call is just going to be ignored. And how do you achieve that? How do you make sure that every single service has these idempotent endpoints? That's your first challenge. And the second challenge was making sure that our workflow engine actually takes advantage of all these services having idempotent calls, because what we would do is we would try, and if we didn't get a confirmation back that it was successful, then we would just hold that process, store the state in the database, and come back to it later, and then try again for a few times. And then, if possible, we would draw back if we couldn't perform all of the actions. Like, why this is the best solution, and how we got to this solution, and how to implement it. These are things that I talk about in a talk. So again, this is something that I will link in the description. But like, this was my second biggest learning in that company. Like, these two things, how to rewrite software safely and incrementally, and how to build resilient services in the face of like uncertainty on what is going to work and what is not going to work. That was two very important learnings from that company. I also had my first leadership position at this company. So I became team lead fairly early on, partly because of my whole past experience with being a freelancer. And I actually even had subcontractors at some point. So I became a leader fairly early on. And one of the things that really surprised me is how little the title counts. If anything, it makes things harder if you are designated as a leader. Because once you're a leader, people have expectations towards you. And once you're a leader, you are much more likely to have to come up against pressure from other people. When you are just a peer, then what you say doesn't come with authority. So people are going to feel compelled to ask questions and dig deeper and understand things in a deeper level. But when you're a leader and when you're their boss, very often people are just going to assume that they shouldn't ask certain questions. And that's wrong. I do want people to ask me questions. I do want people to challenge me. But once you learn that just having the position isn't going to help you, in fact, it's going to make things harder because now you have to influence people who might actually secretly feel resentment towards you. It's tough. It's a lot harder than I thought when I was just an individual contributor. And what makes it even worse is that when you are in a middle management position, you end up in this spot where you're being pressured from two sides. So your team wants you to protect their interests, wants you to convey their message to leadership. But leadership wants you to convey their message and represent their message towards the team. And you end up in this situation where you get conflicting requests from two sides and you need to negotiate that. And it's almost impossible to make everyone happy. And the longer the chain of command is, the harder it becomes. Because the more steps are in between the team and the top of the management, the more chances there are for someone to not understand the team's actual problem or the CTO's actual request. And there is just this chance for miscommunication. So the smaller a company, the shorter the chain of command, the better chances of you have to actually influence things in the right way. But even then, the most important lesson of leadership for me is that you shouldn't think of yourself as the leader. You should try to think of yourself as a peer and try to treat people as if you had no authority at all. And that pressure can actually be really damaging to your mental health. And in my case, I burned out at some point. And the sad part is that I didn't notice that I was not able to work anymore. Like I wanted to keep being a leader. I wanted to keep running my team as if nothing was happening. But at the same time, I was so burnt out that I was really struggling with motivation, really struggling with getting things done. And I think I destroyed a lot of my reputation in that period, because instead of just giving up my position and, I don't know, going back to being an IC for a while, or even just quitting my job for a few months and recovering from burnout, I tried to push through. And the big lesson there is you cannot push through when you have burnout. You do need to rest. You do need to take a break. And that's a lesson that was, I thought I learned it, and then I made the same mistake again before I learned it the second time. So this is actually important. Your mental health should always come first. And when you are able to work and when you are able to do a good job, save up, because especially if you are heading into a leadership position, like this industry is stressful. And being in this middle management position is even more stressful. So if your mental health starts to suffer, like, take a break as soon as you can. And then this brings us to today, where I'm running my own business. I started running my own business about a year ago, and I basically already had the product, right? Lean Poker was already something that I built before, but I decided that as a next step in my career, the best would be is if I tried to make this thing something that can sustain me so that I can run more of these events and let more engineers experience this immediate feedback loop that I was talking about. So basically right now that's my mission. And when it comes to running a business, it comes with a lot of freedom. You don't have to work certain hours. You end up working more on the other hand, but at least on your own terms. Like if you want to go out during the week, you can, and at the same time you might end up working in the weekend, but you need to have a lot of courage. Like starting a business isn't going to start right away, but it's worth it because if your business grows, eventually you are going to make more money. But you need to stick with it for a long time before you start seeing the outcome of your work, which can be really frustrating. Another thing that was interesting in this period is that for quite some time I haven't been coding anymore, and I was mostly just leading teams and managing, and I thought I didn't like coding anymore. But what was interesting is that because I was running my own business and I didn't have any employees at the point, I started coding again. I started modifying things myself, and I realized that I still like coding, and actually I like it a lot more than management. There is just this magic that comes from creating something and seeing it work immediately. That magic has not faded, and I think when I thought I didn't like coding anymore, it was more about the environment I was working in. That's what I didn't like, but the coding itself is quite magical still. If you feel like that this video has given you something, hit the like button and maybe subscribe so that you don't miss my next video, or watch this one here. Bye.